Isaac Newton was born on December 25th in the year 1642. Newton's birthplace is the United Kingdom. Isaac Newton died on March 20th, 1726. Newton's age was 84 years. Newton's scientist was a British mathematician, physicist, astronomer, theologian, and writer. He was the most influential mathematician and scientist of all time. Newton built the first practical reflecting telescope and developed a complex theory of color based on the observation that a prism divides white light into the colors of the visible spectrum. His work on light is included in his influential book Optics, published in 1704. He also formulated the empirical law of cooling, performed theoretical calculations on the speed of sound for the first time, and introduced the concept of the Newtonian fluid. In addition to his work in calculus, as a mathematician, Newton also contributed to the study of power series, extended the binomial theorem to non-integer exponents, developed a method to approximate the roots of functions, and most cubic plane curves are classified. We will learn more about who is Isaac Newton in Sir Isaac Newton biography here. Isaac Newton education. Here, we will learn more about who is Newton. Isaac Newton education states that he was a research fellow at Trinity College and the second Lucas Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge University. He was an unorthodox Christian who privately rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. For the Cambridge faculty at that time, it was unusual for him to refuse to accept the priesthood of the Church of England. Except for his work in mathematical sciences, Newton spent most of his time on alchemy and biblical chronology, but most of his work in these fields was not published until long after his death. Newton was politically and personally associated with the Whig Party. He served as a member of the University of Cambridge for 2 short terms, from 1689 to 1690, and from 1701 to 1702. He was knighted by Queen Anne in 1705 and spent the last 30 years of his life in London, serving as guardian from 1696 to 1699 and Master of the Royal Mint, and President of the Royal Society from 1703 to 1727. Early years. Isaac Newton's birthday is on Christmas Day, December 25, 1642. His father, also named Isaac Newton, died 3 months ago. Newton was born prematurely and was still a child. His mother Hannah Asko reportedly said she could fit him in a quart cup. When Newton was 3 years old, his mother remarried and lived with her new husband, Pastor Barnabas Smith, and gave her son to his grandmother Margaret Eskell, formerly known as Bryce, to care for. Newton did not like his stepfather and maintained some hostility towards his mother marrying him, as this entry in the list of crimes committed before the age of 19 reveals. Newton's mother gave birth to 3 children that were Mary, Benjamin, and Hannah in her second marriage. Between the ages of 12 and 17, Newton was educated at the Grantham King's School, which taught Latin and Greek, and probably taught important fundamentals of mathematics. In October 1659, he was expelled from school and returned to Woolsthorpe Colsterworth. His second widowed mother tried to make him a farmer, an occupation he hated. Henry Stokes, the principal of King's School, convinced his mother to send him back to school. Partly out of a desire to retaliate against campus bullies, he became student number 1, distinguishing himself primarily by building models of sundials and windmills. Isaac Newton's education played a major role in shaping his life. Middle-aged life. Isaac Newton's scientist work is said to have advanced significantly in all branches of mathematics studied at that time. His work on this topic, often referred to as flow or calculus, was seen in the October 1666 manuscript and is now published in Newton's Mathematics Papers. His book De Analysis per Equations was sent by Isaac Barrow to John Collins in June 1669, and Barrow referred to him in a letter sent to Collins in August of the same year, in which he said that these areas have an extraordinary genius and skill. Newton later participated in a debate with Leibniz on the priority of the development of calculus. Leibniz-Newton calculus debate. Most modern historians believe that Newton and Leibniz developed calculus independently, although their mathematical symbols are very different. From time to time it was suggested that Newton published almost nothing about it until 1693, and did not give a full explanation until 1704, and Leibniz began publishing a full explanation of his method in 1684. Leibniz's notation and the differential method are now recognized as more convenient notations, adopted by mathematicians on the European continent, and after about 1820, they were also adopted by British mathematicians. His work makes extensive use of geometric forms of calculus, based on the limiting value of the ratio of least quantities. In the very principle, Newton does this in the name of the method of the first and last ratio. He gave a demonstration and explained why he explained it this way. He also commented that here is an indivisible method of doing the same. The study of gravity. In 1679, Newton referred to Kepler's laws of planetary motion and returned to his work on celestial mechanics, considering the gravity and its influence on planetary orbits. After this, Hooker corresponded briefly with Hooke between 1679 and 1680. Hooke was appointed to administer the Royal Society letter and opened a letter intended to obtain Newton's contribution to the Royal Society transaction. In the winter of 1680 to 1681, the appearance of a comet further stimulated Newton's astronomical interest, and he contacted John Flamsteed about this. After communicating with Hooke, Newton showed that the elliptical shape of the planet's orbit is produced by a centripetal force that is inversely proportional to the square of the radius vector. Newton reported his results to Edmund Halley and the Royal Society in De Motu Corporum in Gyrum. It is a pamphlet written on about 9 sheets of paper and copied to the Royal Society in December 1684. This package contains the nucleus that Newton developed and expanded to form the principle. With the encouragement and financial assistance of Edmund Halley, the principles were published on July 5, 1687. In this work, Newton established 3 general laws of motion. These laws collectively describe the relationship between any object, the force acting on it, and the resulting motion, and laid the foundation for classical mechanics. They contributed to many breakthroughs during the Industrial Revolution that followed, and they have not been improved for more than 200 years. Many of these advancements are still the basis of non-relativistic technologies in the modern world. He used the Latin word gravitas to denote the effect that came to be known as gravity and defined the law of universal gravitation. Optical research. In 1666, Newton observed that the color spectrum leaving the prism at the minimum deviation position is rectangular, even if the light entering the prism is circular, that is, the prism refracts different colors at different angles. This led him to conclude that color is the intrinsic property of light, which has been the subject of controversy until now. From 1670 to 1672, Newton gave a lecture on optics. During this time, he studied the refraction of light and showed that the polychromatic spectrum produced by the prism can be recombined into white light using a lens and a second prism. Modern academic research shows that Newton's analysis and resynthesizes of white light are attributed to particle alchemy. He proved that colored light does not change its characteristics by separating colored light and irradiating it on multiple objects, and whether it is reflected, scattered, or transmitted, the light maintains the same color. Therefore, he observed that the color is the result of the interaction of the object with the already colored light, rather than the color of the object itself. This is called Newton's color theory. From this work, he concluded that any refracting telescope lens suffers from the scattering of colored light. As a proof of concept, he built a telescope that uses a mirror instead of an objective lens to avoid this problem. The construction design, the first known functional reflecting telescope, today called the Newtonian telescope, involves solving the problem of suitable mirror materials and modeling techniques. Newton grinds his own mirrors with custom-made high-reflection mirror metal compositions and uses Newton rings to judge the quality of his telescope optics. At the end of 1668, was able to produce the first reflecting telescope. It is about 8 inches long, and the image is clearer and wider. In 1671, the Royal Society requested that its reflecting telescope be displayed. His interest encouraged him to publish his notes, de couleurs, which he later expanded in optics. When Robert Hooke criticized some of Newton's views, Newton was so angry that he withdrew from the public debate. Newton and Hooker had a brief exchange between 1679 and 1680 when Hooker was appointed to manage the correspondence of the Royal Society and opened a letter aimed at gaining Newton's contribution to the Royal Society's transactions. Newton was inspired to prove that the shape of the elliptical planetary orbit is caused by the centripetal force that is inversely proportional to the square of the radius vector. But until Hooke's death, the conditions of these two men were generally very poor. Personal life. After knowing about who was Newton, we will learn about his personal life. Although some people claimed that he was engaged, Newton never married. The French writer and philosopher Voltaire, who was in London at the time of Newton's funeral, said that he was never sensitive to any passion, not affected by the common weakness of mankind, and did not engage in any transactions with women. Keynes and other writers have commented Newton had a close friendship with the Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio de Duillier, who met in London around 1689. Some of their correspondence has been preserved. Their relationship ended abruptly and inexplicably in 1693, at the same time Newton had a mental breakdown, which included sending crazy accusations to his friends Samuel Pepys and John Locke Letter. His notes to the latter included accusations of Locke's struggling to make me suffer. In 2015, Nobel laureate in physics Steven Weinberg called Newton an unpleasant opponent and a bad guy who can be an enemy of him. He particularly emphasized Newton's attitude towards Robert Hooker and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Death. Newton died in his sleep in London on March 20, 1727. After Isaac Newton's death, his body was buried in Westminster Abbey. Voltaire may have attended his funeral. He was single, so most of his property was transferred to relatives in his later years, and did not have a will when he died. His role went to John Conduit and Catherine Button. After Newton's death, his hair was examined and found to contain mercury, which may be the result of his alchemy search. Mercury poisoning can explain Newton's quirks in old age. This helps us to answer our question, how did Newton die?